All right, everybody. So I have a question for you. If you are talking to somebody and the person says one thing but does another, let's say has different actions or different tone of voice, which one do you believe? So, for example, if you come into class and I'm talking to you and I'm like, "How was your day?" Or you ask me, "How was my day?" and I go, "It's fine." Does it actually sound like I had a fine day? No. My verbal communication, which we talked about in the last video, would be the word fine, but the tone of my voice communicates something else. And fun fact, when your verbal and your nonverbal communication doesn't match, people always refer, or most of the time, believe the nonverbal. And so while we might spend a lot of time when we're thinking about planning messages like a speech or important conversation, asking for a raise, an interview, those kinds of things. We might spend time thinking about the words we want to use, but oftentimes we don't spend time thinking about our nonverbals. And as somebody who teaches or has taught public speaking for a number of years, I can say to you, if you start putting thought into your nonverbal communication on an everyday basis, when you get in those really important situations like an interview or a speech, you don't have to think about them because you have already kind of made the practice of doing so. So this video is dedicated to talking about nonverbal communication. I just want to make a quick note too, in case you are wondering. A friend of mine gave me, you weren't wondering, but a friend of mine gave me this mood ring, and it's not an expensive object, but I wanted to point out that I'm wearing it, and I thought it'd be fun to wear it while I'm recording, to see if it changes colors during the presentation. So the topic that, again, we're going to talk about nonverbal communication. I'm going to go through the definition of it for you, and then we're going to pick apart some of the major elements of nonverbal communication. And this picture here, if you're not looking at the slide, I'll just tell you is of my two little cats. I've alluded to them on other videos. And by the way, Addie is the one who is like a Bengal looking cat. She's a kitten. Well, she's just tiny. She's a cat now. She's in here recording with me again, as per usual. And what's happening in this picture is Pumpkin, my other cat, they're touching hands. And so we are going to talk about touch today as a nonverbal element. So that's why I've included this picture. All right, let's go through. So nonverbal communication, the definition that we would work through with this textbook is communication produced by any a means other than spoken words. So if we were in class and I was kind of drawing on the board, I would just kind of have two spots. One would, for verbal communication, I would just write down those are the words we use. Nonverbal communication is everything else. So communication by anything other than a spoken word. And there is research, and you can look at Arabian's explanation of nonverbal messages. This is how we get to the percentages that I shared with you when we were talking about verbal communication. If you remember, of the 100% of our communication, 7% comes from the words that we use, and the other 93% comes from nonverbal. So what we're looking at here in this chart is how we get to that 93%. 55% approximately comes from body language, but that would also be things like gestures, movement. Sorry, I keep having a scratch over here. Anything to do with our body. And then the 38%, as you can see, our book calls vocalics. If you've taken COM 100 with me, you've probably heard me refer to that as a paralinguistic cue. All that means is it's things like tone, volume, rate, pitch. The ways in which we might alter the words we use are what our author here would call vocalics or vocalics. Tomato, you can call it what you like. As far as I'm concerned, I still like to think of it as a paralinguistic cue. So I mentioned we were also going to talk through the nonverbal elements, and you may be happy to know this is probably going to be a shorter video. The first element that we're going to talk about is touch, the study of touch, or what we call haptics. And the picture that you see here, I'm imagining is at NASA, and you see somebody who looks like they're in a uniform, like a military or NASA related uniform in the all blue. Then you've got somebody in, you know what, I don't actually know what this costume is called, but whatever somebody would wear if they were walking on the moon. It's not a jumpsuit. And anyway, that person's got the whole thing on, and they're walking by and they're high-fiving each other. I always tell students, if you're trying to remember which term is for touch, think about high-fiving somebody. You touch hands and you might say, hey, what's happening as you do this? So like, hey, what's happening? So haptics is the study of touch. We are, as humans, we heavily rely and look for touch in our everyday relationships. Our book would say touch plays an important role in initiating relationships, regulating relationships, and maintaining relationships. And there's a link on this page. I'm not going to play the video, but there is a link that I'll link in the resources about something called touch starvation, which I always find fascinating because it is true. I think we can, oh, sorry, they're a little distracted. I've got noise in my background because both cats are here and they're wanting to play with each other. So I will apologize right now for my distraction. And they're touching each other. So there's haptics that I'm observing. And maybe this is a great example. Like, I was just getting ready to say humans have a need for touch, but apparently so do animals, because these two are like constantly playing and hanging out. But we do. And then there are people who experience touch starvation, which sounds like maybe a not very serious term. But if you look at the research on it, people can become depressed or have a harder time coping or moving through life. They just go through it without any touch. And that's why it's really helpful, I think, for seniors to have people around them and family visits. And also, again, veterans or anybody having any sort of difficult time. Not that all veterans have a difficult time, but a lot of veterans seem to talk about PTSD or even just sort of isolation type experiences. But this is why pets are also so wonderful, because even though the touch is coming from an animal, it still leaves us feeling fulfilled. And so there's a lot of value there. We also have a term our book refers to as oculesics. And if you think about, you have ocular nerves, I suppose, in your eyes. That is a term that describes our eye contact. In most cultures, at least certainly the Western culture, I should reframe what I'm going to say. In Western culture, in most situations, we want to have good eye contact, which is what I hope I'm demonstrating right now for you. That is different than staring, which is, maybe one of these and can feel creepy when people are making, constant eye contact with you and blinking very little. We would certainly want to try to avoid that in interviews. But I would also point out that as you interact with other people, you guys probably already know this, especially if you're in the workplace, there are cultures who are raised to believe that eye contact with professionals, direct eye contact, is a sign of disrespect. And I'm going to be real honest with you. My eyes hurt right now after making direct eye contact because I have a light behind me. And so now my eyes feel like they're burning. But oculesics is the study of eye behavior, if you will, or how we're communicating through our eyes. Then we have gestures, which is what I'm doing right now. For the most part, you can't see them because they're here under the screen or the shot that you can see. But we do use gestures to reinforce our verbal messages for sure. If I'm like, you want to go that way a little bit, if somebody says, how are you? And I'm like, yeah, it's okay. I see, then maybe you understand that hopefully my verbal and my nonverbal messages are matching, and my nonverbal is reinforcing my verbal message. Gestures can add certainly quite a bit of value, or they can be distracting. So as communicators, we want to be mindful of what's happening. As I mentioned, there's something called vocalics or vocalics. And again, that is tone. If you've ever been, well, we've all been teenagers, I suppose, at this point, unless I have somebody who's much younger watching, which has happened in the past. I've had students as young as 10. We've all heard the phrase, it isn't what you said, it's how you said it. I know I heard that as a teenager. And my parents were referring to the tone, to which I always responded, I don't have a tone. And obviously there's a tone in my saying that. But we have to think about, or it's helpful to think about the perception of other people. Even though we don't think we have a tone, other people might perceive that. Things like volume can communicate confidence or the perception of confidence. Certainly in things like interviews. Rate is going to be how quickly or slowly that we're talking. You can think of pitch as in like pitch perfect. We don't really think about altering our pitch all that much in everyday communication. I think of pitch more in terms of like matching pitch in terms of music. Generally, I don't hear anybody talking about pitch. I think if there's anything else, volume, rate, tone, and pitch, those are the big ones. Then we've got kinesics. if you look at the slide here, and again, for those who aren't looking, I've got a picture of Kobe Bryant, probably in the middle of a game with his little Gatorade towel on. He is probably, again, if he's playing basketball, he's moving around. And so it might help you to think about kinesics is the study of movement. And if anybody watching is a kinesiology major, you're studying how the body moves. So you can think kinesiology or kinesics, that's movement, because Kobe Bryant is on the slide when we're talking about kinesics, and he moves his body to play basketball. But also I have him here because he has such a great smile, or he had. Shout out to Kobe Bryant, unfortunately, but he had a wonderful smile. And so our facial expressions are also a form of nonverbal communication. There are seven actually, emotions that are globally recognized, according to Ekman and Friesen, sorry. They include surprise, anger, disgust, fear, interest, sadness, and of course, happiness. Happiness is, I think, of the seven, the most commonly recognized. And by the way, I think I shared this research. I'm sure you guys watched my earlier videos, but in case you didn't, I talked a little bit about how depression and anxiety are much more common in all people than they used to be, but certainly among college students. It would be very helpful, I think, to generally have a smile, to walk around with a smile, because other people will see that and then they will smile. Smiling tends to make people feel better. And you just never know who maybe needed to see that, because one thing a smile does is it communicates to the other person, I see you. I recognize that you're a human standing in front of me. And for somebody who's walking around maybe feeling a little bit invisible, a smile can really go a long way. Plus, maybe it helps you feel better too. Again, we don't want to match the smiling with like a staring, because that doesn't go over real well for anybody thinking of doing that combo. I don't recommend it, but just a general, natural smile, genuine, that's the word I wanted, not general. Then we transition into talking about proxemics. And as you can see here, proxemics is a study through physical space. The way I tell students how to remember this term proxemics is think about approximately how far apart are we in terms of space. And there's a visual that we've got here, and it breaks down halls, the researcher halls, for spaces, like primary categories of space. The first one would be intimate space. So if you're looking at the picture with me, there's a person in the middle who's pictured in purple. So that's like our center, if you will, of the circle. And then about 0 to 18 inches away from that person is a figure in blue. That represents intimate space. You can think about intimate space 0 to 18 inches in terms of like how close might you need to be to somebody to be able to kiss them or hug them, or let's say you're holding a baby, which I was doing earlier today. My arms are exhausted. Even though intimate just means very close in this case, right? 0 to 18 inches. And then the green, the next person, represents 18 inches to 4 feet. That is my personal space. Typically, most people don't want other people inside that circle unless they also can come into the intimate space. The next step outward, if you will, in terms of space is 4 feet to 12 feet, and that's considered social space. That's what we're more comfortable with. And in fact, when COVID was happening, that's sort of where people operated, was like at least that 4 foot window. So I believe there's a quiz question that asks you something about, people's preferred space. You can think about, okay, what were we doing in COVID, which is socially distancing. And then the furthest person out in this figure is, I'm going to say pink, maybe a salmon color, depending on how you define pink. And that's depicting public space, which we can see here is like 12 to 25 feet. That's more likely to happen in public, like maybe in passing if you're on campus. People are a lot further from you. That would be more like public space. And then we have something called chronemics. You can probably guess what this nonverbal element is, because if you think about the word chronological, that means we put things in order by time. So it shouldn't surprise you then that chronemics is when we think about how to use time to communicate. And you might be saying, Carol, we don't use time to communicate. I don't know what you're saying. But different cultures think of time in different ways. And when we get into the chapter on culture, we'll touch on some of those differences. But there is a monochronic way to look at time, and then there's a polychronic view of time. And we would think about a monochronic view of time in terms of countries or cultures that have one way of looking at it, which is like, if you're not here, you're on time, and if you're on time, you're late. Like the military is probably a great example of a monochronic time. Just by showing up at a certain moment on the clock, you have communicated something. Whereas in other cultures, a polychronic view of time says, I don't know, just kind of, get here when you get here. So for example, today I mentioned I was holding a baby, and that's because we had my great nephew's first birthday party. They're twins. It's very cute. Decorated thing 1 and thing 2, because there's twins. And anyway, some people held to a monochronic view of time, which is like, oh, the party's at 12, so they got there 11:45. That's when my mom and my aunt rolled in. If we're on time, we're late. Versus other people, that's actually most of the younger people that came to the party, I think probably have more of a polychronic view of time, which is if the party starts at 12, I'll get there about 12:40. We'll see how that works. I don't know, 12:27. It's just different ways of looking at time. And so for you all, if you have a polychronic view of time, for example, and you're thinking of looking for a job after graduation, you want to consider the culture that you're going into. Most professional cultures have a monochronic view of time, which is to say, if your shift starts at 8 o'clock, they expect you to be there ready to work at that time, not rolling in and then getting coffee and then talking to everybody and then sitting down and working. If that kind of time system doesn't work for you, you might want to look for companies and cultures that do match your value of time or the way you like to express time. We also have artifacts. And again, I'm glad you're still with me because we are almost done. Artifacts are talked about in our book as items that are adorned on one's body or carried. And that's why if you're looking at our visual aid, here you can see someone who kind of reminded me of Kat Von D, might be an AI person, I don't know, but has a lot of tattoos. People who get tattoos that I am aware of generally get them with some sort of intention in mind, with the exception of Pete Davidson. I saw him on a talk show recently from, some of you probably know him from Saturday Night Live. Someone asked him about his tattoos and he's like, yeah, I don't know, they were just kind of dumb. Also, I was maybe under the influence when I got them, so they weren't all intentional, but oftentimes people get tattoos to communicate something either to themselves or to others. And again, that would be something you want to think about in terms of if you are heavily tattooed, depending on the company you want to work for, you either want to maybe hide those tattoos or, wear things that don't showcase them. Or I would never tell you, because you guys, I think I told you I've spent a lot of time working in career services and with employers. I never coach people to say, try to pretend you're somebody else. I would either find a company that you can work with the dress code options, or find a company that likes you just the way you are. You don't have to try to fit yourself into a mold. And the last thing you want is probably to try to pretend you're somebody else for 8 to 10 hours a day, multiple days a week. That's just, career advice that I typically offer. And then the last item on this slide is what we call olfactics. And I don't have a great cheat code for this, if you will, but this is when we think about, because most people aren't familiar with like the nose, terms, technical terms for the nose, but this one is for scent. So maybe you could think about it in terms of like, oh, that's a whole lot of perfume. It's an olfactic for scent. I don't know. I want to say drop a note in the chat, but obviously you guys aren't with me live, so you can't do that. But maybe in your weekly summaries, you can tell me if that was helpful. Speaking of interviewing, we go to the next slide where we talk about physical appearance. Everything that we wear, how we wear things, the color of our hair, if we have makeup, if we, the shoes that we're wearing, everything that has to do with our physical appearance communicates something. And what you're looking at here on this slide is a wide range of business attire, from sort of more business casual to maybe semi-professional dress. Again, for an interview, you want to try to match the company or the culture that you are applying for, and certainly the position. For example, you would not want to wear a suit if you were going to apply for a cashier job at Target. That's not necessary. On the other hand, if you just graduated from college and you are going into more of a traditional, let's say, office job, you might consider either wearing a full suit or at least a jacket, just that will depend on the message you're trying to communicate and also the company, like I said, you're walking into. Our book also talks about something called body positivity. Some of you might, that's a more common term now, so some of you might be more familiar with it. And again, it refers to a lifestyle choice one or more than one might make to show love or care for and take pleasure in one's physical attributes. I have a lot of thoughts on body positivity, and I'm sure you guys do too. I wish I could hear them. But I will say that anytime you can view yourself as positive, you're reinforcing a positive self-concept, which reinforces a positive self-worth, which then bridges the gap, obviously, between you and your ideal self, and it only adds value. So if you're somebody who is not body positive, in fact, I've met people who are in great shape and they say, I'm really embarrassed by my calves or my biceps or my triceps or whatever. They're always focused on what's not great about themselves. And as you can imagine, when we put that energy out and we sort of almost energetically draw attention to things we're not happy about, other people, I think, can pick up on that, even if it's only energetically. So we'll talk briefly about the 5 competencies of the Be Body Positive model. And I think this is our last main slide. One would be thinking about reclaiming your health. And that is, instead of thinking about what does the scale say and does that number represent my value as a human, instead of that, we can think about, okay, well, what does my health look like? The number on the scale is one indicator of my health. And a body positive way to approach, health would be, okay, let me address the things that would give me better health, as opposed to what changes the number on the scale. Number 2, practicing intuitive self-care is really listening to the needs of your body and also what's happening. In my personal opinion, I think I had a harder time doing that in my 20s because you sort of take health and wellness and vitality for granted, or maybe you don't, but I did. And I didn't really learn to be mindful for a number of years, maybe into my 30s and certainly then into my 40s. And as I approach 50, I'm definitely aware. Things just hurt because you're getting older, not because of that you did anything or had an injury. But it's helpful to be aware so that number 3, you can cultivate self-love. I know it sounds like, oh, geez, what is she talking about? But in my mind, the value of cultivating self-love is that, again, everything we believe and the communication we have within ourselves comes out in our relationships with others. If we don't practice and cultivate self-love, my logical question is, how can we expect other people to offer it to us? Because if we don't see the value enough to give it to ourselves, how can we accept it from others? And so this talks about making those life affirming choices, things that add to your health and wellness that help you feel good about yourself. Number 4, declare your own authentic beauty. And the one thing I'll say about this is, just like I was talking about with the workplace, you don't have to fit yourself into a box. Ideally, you find an employer who says, wow, you're amazing, just like you are. And of course, if you believe that, then that just makes you both on the same page about your greatness. We don't all have to look the same. And I know that there is quite a bit of pressure to look like somebody on this magazine or that movie or what have you. And as we talked about in an earlier presentation, the more we look outward to figure out who we're supposed to be for our ideal self, the greater chance we have of unhappiness, because we can't be somebody else. The best we can do is really step into who we are. And if there is something about ourselves we want to change, we take positive steps to do that. Number 5 says, though, build community. It is very easy, particularly for college students and particularly those of you who had formative years during COVID, to feel very isolated, especially if some of you spend a lot of time online. Yes, you can use online to build community, but there's a tremendous amount of value in building community in real life, face-to-face experiences, like in-person classes, for example, or going out to a church group or a social group or a volunteer group or what have you. Anything that can get you around other people, even if it feels awkward at first, it may help you to engage with others in a way where when they see your value, it helps you see your value as well. versus if you're always in your own brain and thinking like, I don't think I have any value. So we talked about what are the nonverbal elements, as well as what nonverbal communication is. Hope that you have found that helpful. I look forward to seeing your weekly reflections and hope to see you guys soon. Bye, everybody.